Shalom Chaverim, hello friends, and welcome to Kehilat Hadagim Mechutz Lamayim, the congregation of fish out of water. As I have said in basically all of my videos, this began as a Bible study, and we've been going literally through the entire Bible, or working our way through the entire Bible, starting at Genesis, stopping in the middle of Genesis and working on Job, finishing Genesis, and then going on to Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and we are in the process of completing the book of Judges. There's some debate as to the dating of the time of the Judges. The earlier accounts could have actually taken place while Joshua was still conquering the land. In all likelihood, this is not the case. As we recall, Joshua 24:31 says, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua and had known all the deeds of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Well, the time of the book of Judges, we see that nobody really seems to be serving the Lord. Although Israel could be referring to Israel as the southern tribes, because we're finding toward the end of the book that the northern tribes are really quite disobedient to the Lord. And we'll see the consequences. The implication here is that the time of Joshua and the time of the succeeding elders was marked by a time of righteousness and obedience. Most scholars argue that the time of the Judges, which by implication was anything but a time marked by righteousness and obedience, lasted about 300 years. If one would add up the years when Israel was under oppression, plus the years that Israel was under the jurisdiction of a judge, as literally outlined in the book of Judges, it comes to around 410 years. So there's a sizable discrepancy between what many scholars say and what the book of Judges itself says. I suppose that this could be reconciled by including the time of the oppression, in some cases as occurring simultaneously with the time that the judge was judging Israel. Feasibly as well, because some of the events were localized, some of them could have been happening simultaneously. Hence, two or more judges could have been functioning as judges during the same period of time. Whatever the length of time the era of the judges was, we at least know that at least a minimum of 300 years had occurred during the time of the judges from beginning to end. This is an important fact to know in light of what we are about to study in Judges chapter 19 through 21. It's pretty much a given that up until the account of Dan's migration north, which we'd studied last time, the events in the book of Judges took place in chronological order. The events of chapters 17 through 18 could have preceded the account of Samson, which might explain why Dan mustering an army is not mentioned in the account where Judah is mentioned in this capacity. That is, Judah is mentioned along with the account of Samson. Only Judah, as we recall, tied Samson up and handed him over to the Philistines. But there's no mention of the Danites, of which Samson was really a tribe. But chapters 19 through 21 are most definitely not mentioned chronologically. We consider the possibility that 17 and 18 are in chronological order, but these chapters that we're studying today are not. This is clear by the explicit statement in Judges chapter 20, verse 28. Some people call this man Phineas. I'm sorry, his name's not Phineas. Get used to it. His name was Pinchas. Pinchas. And he's son of Eleazar, Aaron's son. And he stood before that would be the Holy of Holies and the Ark of the Covenant, to minister in those days, saying, "Shall I yet again go out to battle against the sons of my brother Benjamin, or shall I cease?" And the Lord said, "Go up, for tomorrow I will deliver them into your hand." Well, we don't exactly know yet what this is talking about, but we will find out. Nevertheless, we know that during this time, Eleazar, or rather Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, Aaron's son, stood before the Ark of the Covenant. Now, Pinchas, as you may recall, knew Moses and certainly knew Joshua. Before Israel had ever entered into the Promised Land, we recall from the book of Numbers that while Israel was still on the east side of the Jordan, not having crossed miraculously by the parting of the Jordan, as we recall from the early chapters of Joshua, many of her men wound up cavorting with Moabite women in accordance with the worship of the Moabite god Baal Peor. One Israelite brazenly took a Moabite prostitute into his tent in front of all the people, and Pinchas, also in front of all the people, thrust them through with his spear. Pinchas's zeal for what was right and for the Lord is beyond demonstration. And Pinchas's involvement in the event of chapters 19 through 21 here is quite evident. So we see that the events of Judges chapters 19 through 21 take place very early in the era of the Judges. The reason why this is important is because as a result of the events of Judges chapters 19 through 21, the tribe of Benjamin is almost completely eliminated from the face of the earth. And yet 300 years is enough time for its population to grow so that Israel's first king can come from the tribe of Benjamin, as we'll read later on in the book of 1 Samuel. Chapter 19 begins with a reminder. Vayehi bayamim ha'em, and it was in those days, umelech ein b'Yisrael, and there was no king in Israel. I insert, now in those days when there was no king in Israel, the following happened. I inserted the last phrase, so I did not insert the last phrase, which was traditionally, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. But I'm inserting what follows in this case. So what was it that was happening that people were doing which was right in their own eyes? And so the narrative goes on. A certain Levite who was a ger, a sojourner, that's the Hebrew word for sojourner, in Ephraim, traveled south to Beit Lechem, or what is commonly called Bethlehem, and acquired a concubine for himself. Now the NASB says that she played the harlot. Personally, I don't think that's what was happening. And it doesn't catch the gist of what's going on. The Hebrew, tizinah, more accurately translates that she had a feeling of revulsion towards him. So she runs away to her father's house and she stays there for 4 months. Those of you who know me know that I have held as axiomatic Paul's declaration to men, "Husbands, love your wives as Messiah loved the ecclesia and gave himself for her." Admittedly, this hadn't always been the case with yours truly, but it is nevertheless a task of the husband to protect the weaker vessel, his wife, from the onslaughts of the world, and to provide for her sense of security. I say that this isn't always the case in yours truly. I confess I'm a sinner. Some people do it better than I, but by the grace of God, my wife and I have been married for 44 years. I don't know, I guess she's not very smart. She decided to stick with me. Nevertheless, the concubine wasn't playing the harlot on him. She was revulsed by him. This most likely was not the case between the Levite and his concubine. Vayakam Isha Vayelech Achareha. So the man got up and went after her. L'daber al liba, to speak to her heart. I suppose girls like to hear sweet nothings. I'm convinced that this is what the Levite was speaking to her. Sweet nothings. As an aside, I say this to you girls. If you want a good husband, get to know him. His likes and dislikes. Make sure that he substantially demonstrates his love for you, and that you're able to communicate with one another, and doesn't just want to get into your pants. I say that bluntly, but deep down in the heart and the gut of a lot of men, that's their motive. The results that might come from falling for a smooth-talking man can be painful. That's what happens here in the case of our Levite friend. He proceeded to smooth-talk her in order to win her back. She brings the Levite to her father's house, and her father is glad to meet him. Hospitality was very important in those days, and should be the case as well in these days. And so the man stays and is entertained by his father-in-law for 4 days. On the 5th day, the Levite gets up to leave with his servant and his concubine, his host's daughter. But her father detains him. "Stay, eat, drink, let's enjoy each other's company." So the Levite winds up staying long enough for much of the day to have gone by. Nevertheless, eager to set off back to the place where he was sojourning, he gets a late start on the day, so he, his servant, and his concubine have to stop somewhere along the way to spend the night. Heading back north, the sun goes down. He has an opportunity to stop at Yovus, or what is commonly called Jebus, which was later become known as Jerusalem, but it was still occupied by the heathen Jebusites, and so he had a feeling that they wouldn't be safe there in Jebus or Yavuz. He decided to move on so they could spend the night in Gibeah, which belongs to the tribe of Benjamin. They were landsmen. They were fellow Israelites. When they came to Gibeah, they went and sat down in the open square of the city, but no one was willing to take them in and give them lodging. Finally, an elderly man, coming from the open fields, where he had been working late into the evening, invited the Levite and his little entourage to his house to spend the night. As an aside, I asked the question, what was an elderly man doing working late? It says something about the people of Gibeah right off the bat. They were to take care of the elderly. Look at our society. Are we taking care of the elderly? By God's grace, in many cases we are. Nevertheless, that should have been the case with Gibeah. But it doesn't seem that it was. I believe that what happens next explains why this account does not follow the chronology of events in the book of Judges. I would hold that it has been placed at the end of the book to emphasize the depravity into which Israel had fallen, particularly the tribe of Benjamin. The men of the city surrounded the old man's house and pounded on the door, crying, Hotzei et ha'ish asher ba el beit techa v'nadanu. Bring out the man who came to your house, that we may know him. The word yada, where we get that word v'nadanu, nada takes it into the first person plural. We will know. Is always used in reference to sexual intercourse. Not always, but almost always. And that is clearly what is meant here. The wording here is almost exactly the same as that of the men of Sodom who surrounded the house of Lot so that they could know the angels who had been his guests. In fact, according to the Faith Life Study Bible, this account has exactly the same number of words as the account of the attempted rape of the angels by the men of Sodom in Genesis chapter 19. The emphasis here is to show that within a very short time after entering into the promised land, and in spite of Ephraim and Benjamin having the law of Moses at their disposal, they'd fallen into a level of depravity comparable to that of Sodom and Gomorrah. Protect himself, the sweet-talking Levite sends his concubine out the door to endure an entire night of being raped by the men of the city. In the dawn, she crawls to the threshold of the house and dies. The next morning, the Levite hangs her over her donkey and takes her to his home in a remote area of Ephraim, a little bit north of Benjamin. And he cuts her dead body into 12 pieces and scatters the 12 pieces throughout the 12 tribes of Israel. Verse 30 of chapter 19 says, all who saw it, that is, the carcass pieces, said, nothing like this has ever happened or been seen from the day when the sons of Israel came up from the land of Egypt to this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak up. Almost all of the fighting men of Israel gathered at Mizpah. Judges 21, verse 28, points to an exception in that not everyone did show up. There are 400,000 fighting men gathered together. They inquire of Benjamin as to what had happened. The Levite with his concubine recounted all that had occurred, except he perceived that the men of Gibeah had intended to kill him rather than just rape him. Upon hearing this, the people resolved not to leave until the men of Gibeah had been punished. They sent men throughout Benjamin to call upon them to put the perpetrators of the rape and murder of the Levite's wife to death. Benjamin chose not to do so, but elected to defend Gibeah and engage the men of Israel in battle. The men of Benjamin, by willing to defend their brethren, displayed a disregard for the law of God as outlined in Mosaic law, and apparently weren't upset by the nature of the atrocity perpetrated by their brethren. Deuteronomy 11:6-9 states, "If your very own brother, or your son, or daughter, or wife, or the wife you love, or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, 'Let us go and worship other gods,' gods that neither you nor your ancestors have known, gods of the peoples around you, whether near or far, from one end of the land to the other, do not yield to them or listen to them. Show them no pity. Do not spare them or shield them. You must certainly put them to death. Your hand must be the first in putting them to death, and then the hands of all the people." I'm not going to get into a debate. I am entirely of the opinion that being involved in the rape of a woman, and in the mass rape of a woman, is a form of idolatry. These men had placed sex over and above faithfulness to God. So in that regard, yeah, it was idolatry. Nevertheless, we see that the wife or the husband or the brother is supposed to be willing to put an idolater to death. And yet these were cousins. These were of the same tribe, and they were not willing to put the perpetrators of this terrible atrocity to death. They had become complicit in this behavior. Jesus said, "He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." We often hear of the yeast of the Pharisees. Sin is like yeast. It spreads throughout the entire loaf. The one who sins, unless he is held accountable by those closest to him, makes those closest to him participants in his sin. To sin is not just something that's private. It affects everyone around you. Benjamin, by defending their brother at Gibeah, had become party to their sin. Israel, led by Judah, was being righteous. The evil of Benjamin had to be excised from their midst. Israel inquired of God, who told them that Judah should go first against Benjamin. Benjamin's fighters were well trained and equipped. There is no mention that Israel complied, that Judah complied. The text says that Israel went up against Benjamin, with no specific mention of Judah going first. And so we really don't know if the exact orders given by God were obeyed. The first day of the battle, 22,000 men of Israel fell at the hands of the skilled warriors of Benjamin. Israel wept before the Lord and inquired again if they should fight Benjamin. The Lord said, "Go." Israel went up, but lost 18,000 men. Israel was confident that they were doing the right thing. But why were they being defeated? Israel went up to Bethel, where the ark of the Lord was, and wept and fasted for an entire day. Pinchas, whom we'd mentioned earlier, was there serving the Lord serving before the Lord. Israel offered whole burnt offerings and peace offerings, zevach hashlemim, before the Lord. The peace offerings were eaten by the men. This time the Lord said, "Go, I will deliver them into your hand." Israel's victory over Benjamin is reminiscent of her victory over Ai, or as some people call it, Ai, the second city that they attacked after enticing the land. She was defeated during the first attack because there was sin in the camp. As we recall, Achan, or Achin, had taken cherem, loot that had been banned and dedicated to God from Jericho. Israel was not entirely righteous. For one thing, she needed an atonement, as was symbolized by the sacrifices offered at Bethel. But there's a marked similarity in the progress and strategy of the two battles as well. In both cases, a segment of Israel's army retreated while the armies of the respective cities left the cities to pursue those in retreat. The cities, now left defenseless, were entered, burned, and destroyed by another contingency of Israel. As with Ai, whose inhabitants were totally destroyed, every man, woman, and child of Benjamin, for the exception of 600 men who had fled to take refuge at the rock of Rimmon, were put to death. Israel almost did to Benjamin what it had done to Ai, completely annihilated. In fact, Israel had done to Benjamin what God had almost done to Benjamin, what God had done to Sodom and Gomorrah, completely annihilated. Benjamin had confirmed the prophetic word of their father Jacob in Genesis 49:27. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey, and in the evening he divides the spoil. But unlike the people of Ai, Benjamin had to be preserved as one of the tribes of Israel. The 11 tribes who fought against Israel had not made provision for this. Jesus said, "Again you have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord.' But I say to you, make no vow at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statement be, yes, yes, or no, no. Beyond anything else is evil." It seems that back then the people of Israel were in the habit of making vows. As we recall, Jephthah had made a vow earlier in chapter 11. In that vow, we're left to wonder whatever happened to his daughter. Was she put to death because he had to fulfill his vow? That's another story. I don't want to digress. Let's move on. Now, according to chapter 21, verse 1, prior to the battle, Israel had made a foolish vow. Now the men of Israel had sworn in Mizpah, saying, "None of us shall give his daughter to Benjamin in marriage." So now Benjamin is down to 600 men without wives. They had to figure out how to get wives for the men. Otherwise, the tribe of Benjamin would cease to exist. Having realized that the men of Jabesh Gilead, or the dry land of Gilead, had not joined in the battle, and thus condoned the behavior of the Benjamites of Gibeah This was the tribe, by the way, that was the exception that I'd said earlier. Not all the people went to meet for battle. So this was the exception to the rule. Israel struck the territory of Yabesh Gilead, killing everyone but virgin girls, whom they gave to the surviving men of Benjamin. There remained, however, 200 Benjamite men without wives. So Israel told the remaining men of Benjamin to lie in wait for girls from Shiloh, where there was a festival to the Lord. As we recall back in the Torah, and all Scripture looks back at the Torah and forward to Jesus, we see that there were three festivals that were to be observed. We don't know which festival this was. Nevertheless, they were to lie in wait for the girls coming out from this festival and kidnap them, grab them when they came out. And when Israel would complain, or the people of Shiloh would complain, Israel would simply say, "You didn't break your vow. You didn't give your daughters to the men of Benjamin. They were taken from you." Interesting logic, isn't it? In this manner, the population of the tribe of Benjamin was replenished, and each man returned to his home. And the book of Judges ends with the words, Bayamim hahem, Ein melech b'Yisrael, ish ha-yashar be'enov ya'aseh. In those days, there was not a king in Israel, and each man did what was right in his own eyes. The last 5 chapters of the book of Judges addresses many issues. In the last lesson, I'd mentioned that descendants from the tribe of Manasseh served contrary to the will of God as Kohanim, or priests, for the false religion begun by the tribe of Dan. An astute member of our group, Kihilat Hadagim Mechutz Lamayim, pointed out to me that some translations, based on other manuscripts, assert that it wasn't a descendant of Manasseh, but of Moses. Likewise, Levites, for the likely exception of Pinchas in today's lesson, have forgotten their roles. Some have said that freedom is only a generation from being lost. Likewise, in this case, God and his law was only a generation from being ignored and forgotten. Furthermore, there's a discrepancy between the conduct of the northern and southern tribes. The first king of Israel is a descendant of one of the 600 survivors of this battle. Was his great-great-grandmother the victim of a kidnapping? By the same token, the second king of Israel was a descendant of the tribe of Judah, the most prominent of the southern tribes, the ones who punished the tribe of Benjamin. Furthermore, that king was destined to be the progenitor of the Messiah. Also, if we look into the immediate future of Israel, it was going to be divided into 2 nations. What happens in the north, in the book of Judges, is a look into what is destined to happen to the northern kingdom. Given to idolatry, it is to precede the southern kingdom in exile and disappear until God finally reveals those who are its members in the future. God bless you. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed our lesson today. And our next lesson is going to be from the book of Ruth. Ruth takes place during the time of Judges and is a microcosm of the exception of people who lived during that time. Again, God bless you, and be well, be safe. Hug those you love. Amen.